Good afternoon and most welcome to 1523 of the series. We will continue the previous long lecture with a shorter one here, and it's the text by Jacques Derrida of an apocalyptic tone recently adopted in philosophy. There seemed to be another text by Derrida in a similar area. So it might be that we struck gold here. I will continue on page 15, where I left off. "8 years ago, right here in fact is the first paragraph, I had spoken of veil and castration, of interpreters, of hermeneutics and hermetics. I have forgotten my umbrella is a statement at once hermetic and totally open, as secret and superficial as the postcard Apocalypse it announces and protects against. And elsewhere in Glas, and in Economimesis, I indicated the intrigue of a certain veil of Isis, around which Kant and Hegel had more than once busied themselves. I am going to expose myself to taking and tying up again with the threads of this intrigue and with the treatment of castration faced with Isis. About the veil of Isis and about castration, Kant says nothing that visibly refers them to one another within the same demonstrative argument. I observe only a kind of tropical continuity, but the tropical transference, the metaphorical and the analogical is exactly our problem. The mystagogues of modernity, according to Kant, do not simply tell us what they see, touch, or feel. They have a presentiment of, they anticipate, they approach, they smell out. They are the men of imminence and the trace. For example, they say they have a presentiment of the sun and cite Plato. They say that every philosophy of presentiment of the sun, Kant is ironical about this presentiment of the sun. He multiplies his sarcastic remarks. These new Platonists give us, through sentiment or presentiment, only a theatrical sun, a chandelier in some. And then these people abuse metaphors, figurative expressions, in order to sensitize us, to make us presensitive to this presentiment. So the zest of it, Kant is not doing this, it is the others, the new Platonists. Kant himself has no feeling, no Stimmung, no mood. Here's an example of this. Kant cites his adversaries. To approach so near the divine wisdom that one can perceive the quivering of its garment, rather than its light touch, as the French translation says. Or again, since he cannot raise the veil of Isis, at least it can be made so thin that one can have a presentiment of the goddess under it. To raise the veil of Isis here is aufheben, and one can still dream between the gala of this Aufhebung and that apocalyptic unveiling. Kant fires off his dart. Thin to what point, he asks, that we are not told. Probably not thin enough, still too thick for one not to be able to do what one wants with the ghost behind its veil or sheet. For otherwise, if the veil was absolutely thin, transparent, this would be a vision, a seeing, and Kant notes in quite mercilessly taking aim, that must be avoided. Above all, we must not see, we must not have only a presentiment under the veil. Then our mystagogues play on the ghost and the veil. They replace the evidences and proofs with analogies, verisimilitudes. Well, they do exactly what Lakoff-Johnson showed that abstract is coming from, by analogies, by verisimilitudes, by metaphors and metonyms. These are the words. Kant cites them and calls us to witness. You see, they are not true philosophers. They resort to poetic schemas. All that is so much literature. We know this scene well today, and it is, among other things, to this repetition that I would like to draw your attention, not to take sides or come to a decision. I shall do no such thing. Between metaphor and concept, literary mystagogy and true philosophy, but for a start to recognize the one solidarity of this antagonists, or protagonists. Consider now that Kant first proposes the word or the image of castration, or more rigorously of emasculation, as one example of those analogies or verisimilitudes, this new mystical Platonic language. Abuses to manipulative ends. He first takes them from a sentence of that Schlösser, who just translated and introduced Plato's letters. Nietzsche might have made something of this name Schlösser, as he did of a Schleiermacher, the first maker of hermeneutic veils. Schlösser is the locksmith. My note here is wrongly spelt in the article. It should be with an The man who makes or keeps the keys, true or false, but also the official in charge of looking up, the one who closes and knows all about closure, expert as he is in the speaking of it, in producing it, or in getting the better of it. This Schlösser then had spoken by figure of the emasculation of reason, and he had accused metaphysical sublimation, actually how it's spelled here, it means the makers of castles. You can see Schlosser as a maker of castles as well in this new take. Inadmissible analogy in Kant's eyes. Abusive because it takes the place of proof by coming to the place where the demonstration leaves a lack. But also scandalous because, in truth, those who adorn themselves with this new tone in philosophy emasculate and make a corpse of reason. To this very end, he says, for want of rigorous proofs, some analogous verisimilitudes are enlisted as arguments. Thus, the fear of emasculation, says castration, the fear of emasculation of reason, made so enervated by metaphysical sublimation, that it has trouble bearing the shock in its fight against vice. And Kant immediately turns the argument inside out, I would say, like a glove. Whereas, nevertheless, he says, precisely in these a priori principles does practical reason find an exact feeling that it never otherwise had a presentiment of, and indeed rather by the empirical that is falsely attributed to it. Is it emasculated and paralyzed? In castration, if castration is a metaphor of simulacrum, and so it must be, since it concerns the phallus, not the penis or the clitoris, then the metaphorical stake is clear between the two opposing parties sketched out by a Kant who's no less a party in this the stake for this Kampfplatz of metaphysics is the castration of reason. Kampfplatz means battleground. which of the two parties facing each other most surely castrates reason, or more seriously, which of the two unmans entmant this descendant of Logos that is ratio? Each of the two, we just heard them without the least equivocation, would accuse the other of castrating the Logos and of defalcating its phallus. And into this debate, phallogocentric on both sides, therefore throughout we could put Freud on the scene as a third robber, procuring the key, true or false, the sexual theory, namely that for this stage of reason, wherein there is only male reason, only a masculine or castrated organ or canon of reason, everything proceeds in this just as for the stage of infantile genital organization, which there is definitely a masculine but no feminine. Perhaps he would speak of a phallic stage of reason. The antithesis here, Freud says at the end of the infantile genital organization, is between having a male genital and being castrated. No sexual difference as opposition, but only the masculine. This strange logic, reason since Freud, Lacan would say, could be followed quite far into the details of the text, above all in the moments when the veil of Isis unleashes what Freud calls Bemächtungstrieb, the drive for mastery. Kant, for example, accuses the mystagogic metaphysicians of behaving like musclemen, who lately preach with enthusiasm a wisdom that costs them nothing, since they claim they have caught this goddess, by the end of her robe. And thus have made themselves her masters and lords. They would have mastered her, and so on. The castration or not of the logos as ratio is a central form of this debate around metaphysics. It is also a fight around poetics, around the death or the future of philosophy. The stake is the same. Kant does not doubt this. The new preachers need to pervert philosophy into poetry in order to give themselves grand airs. To occupy, through simulacrum and mimicry, the place of the great, to usurp thus an essentially symbolic power. Schlösser, the locksmith, we could also say right here, the man of the lordly castle, not only abuses poetic metaphors, he accuses his century of being prosaic, and he dares to write to Plato, addresses him, invokes him, apostrophizes him, calls him to witness. Arme Plato, poor Plato. If you were not marked with the seal of antiquity, who would still want to read you in the prosaic century, in which the highest wisdom consists in seeing only what is at our feet and admitting only what can be grasped with the hands? Locked in combat with this Schlösser, who thraces the new sons of the earth, Kant plays Aristotle against Plato, but unfortunately, this reasoning is not conclusive. It proves too much. For Aristotle, a manifestly prosaic philosopher, also clearly has the seal of antiquity, and could of this account lay claim, he too, to being read. At bottom, all philosophy is indeed prosaic, and to propose today to go back to philosophizing poetically could well pass for proposing to the shopkeeper that he henceforth no longer write his account in books in prose, but in verse. An excellent sentence that sort of sums at least the first part up. I'll repeat it. Venomous attack from Kant. Could well pass for proposing to the shopkeeper that he henceforth no longer writes his account in books, in prose, but in verse. The ultimate proof, or I would say kicker into the direction of detoning. And where does this kick come from? The biggest of them all, or the second biggest? The kick to detone. Where? Well, the shopkeeper's book, written in prose, is the correct variety. And what sort of prose is that? Numbers, figures. The scientific precursor or primordial substance. Mathematics. Kant reveals himself as holding this more dear than anything else, maybe on par of science. But I would say mathematics is one step ahead, causing the great divide, making, in the view of Kant, necessary the detonement of language, understanding and thinking. And he even sees not doing that would castrate some fantastic essence, the phallogocentrism of mathematics or science. I'd say that we can infer logocentrism there. The idea of now, presence. Because, in a way, mathematics doesn't have time. It's atemporal. Or at least, that is what we think. Disembodied, non-moving. Mathematics seems to be eternally true. Taking it away is feared by Kant as castration, emasculation. The male organ of ratio, of understanding, of making a shopkeeper's book to work as there wouldn't be a lack in the book. take a little pause there, and I'm going to put something on the... So I feel this is where it all hinges on, and a D-tone language comes to the fore, maybe because of mathematics. It's hard to say what is the hen, what is the chicken, what is the egg. Maybe they come simultaneously. But it's not hard to see, were it not for mathematics and science, Kant would not take this route. Absolutely certain. And the mystagogues that he attacks castrates this. And it's amazing to hear a sentence like this. I'm really happy about this. Already from late 18th century. I don't remember the exact year, but it's pretty early on.
Du menar på att det är stoppkeeper?
It's earlier. It's 200-300 years old. 1796, yes. And to understand the Kantian text and Derrida, we need to come to the same foundation as Derrida. He knew intuitively, without ever mentioning it, that the D-tone language, mathematics, or the neutral language of science, is in itself a mode. Something he never ever mentioned, but is still important to embody in oneself to get to an understanding. And that will help to see the rage almost that Kant has as against the mystagogic metaphysicians, behaving like musclemen who lately preach, notice that also, the term preach, with enthusiasm of a wisdom that costs them nothing, since they claim they have caught this goodness by the end of her rope, and thus have made themselves her master and lords. They would have mastered her, and so on. Let's look into mathematics. I will now parallel the text with Paul M. Livingston, Wittgenstein mathematics and the temporality of technique. And the remark, possibly something that Derrida read, I consider myself that he had himself naturally from his background a deeper understanding that he brought into his deconstruction and all his literary works. But page 2, last paragraph, we see the following. In a much discussed remark written in 1944, from the Remarks on the Foundations of Mathematics, Wittgenstein considers, as he repeatedly does in RFM, the question whether a string of 3 sequential 7s occurs in the decimal expansion of pi. And he questions the following. What harm is done by, for instance, saying that God knows all irrational numbers? And listen now. or that they are already there, even though we only know certain of them. And here, already there means a priori, before thinking. We have once more the Kantian box that we live in today. It's not exclusive to Kant, it's for all of us. Why are these pictures not harmless? For one thing, they hide certain problems. Suppose that people go on and on calculating the expansion of pi. So God, who knows everything, knows whether they will have reached 777 by the end of the world, by the apocalypse. But can his omniscience decide whether they would have reached it after the end of the world? It cannot. I want to say, even God can determine something mathematical only by mathematics. Even for him, the mere rule of an expansion cannot decide anything that it does not decide for us. We might put it like this. If the rule for the expansion has been given us, a calculation can tell us that there is 2 at the 5th place. Could God have known this without calculation, purely from the rule of expansion? I want to say no. This is a similar point made by Douglas Hofstadter in Gödel, Escher, Bach. By claiming omniscience here, you are claiming that God cannot exist. It would be a non-active God who cannot participate in the world. He just thinks. And that, my friends, that is more true emasculation. One commentator who has taken this remark to involve an anti-realist attitude toward mathematical truth is Hilary Putnam. On Putnam's reading of it in Wittgenstein, Realism and Mathematics, it shows that Wittgenstein held, at least at this time, that a mathematical proposition cannot be true unless we can decide that it is true on the basis of a proof or calculation of some kind. In particular, Putnam takes Wittgenstein to be here, asserting that in the case the world ends without our having determined whether or not the sequence of sevens occurs. The statement that 7-7 occurs in expansion is neither true nor false. This view as Putnam interprets it, is itself based on considerations about the way mathematical truth depends on what we can do. That is, what we are in fact able to establish, calculate, or verify. By the end of the world, in limiting truth in this way, thus amounts to a mathematical form of verificationism on Putnam's reading, comparable in some respects with the verificationist positions of mathematical intuitionists and logical empiricists. So what is clarified here in a way that it's not directly clear by misunderstanding or having said that God has a detoned language that doesn't say anything, and therefore he can, and now it becomes a little bit weird, therefore God can think about mathematical truths without doing them. This is a new way of looking at God. The old way was, if God builds a cathedral, he does it brick by brick, thereby doing an action. But say that God does it by atonal things without doing is emasculating God, leaves him without a doing in the world. This is comparable to the Newtonian deistic view, effectively. And I would say that remark I really like from Derrida earlier on, a copy of Kant, that Plato did what he did without meaning it, intending it, can be transferred to Newton, because what Kant says is Newtonian. It's an emasculated God. And for our bodies, our thinking, God then becomes an impossibility. Even if you, like Newton, still said you believe in God, effectively it doesn't work, since action is taken away from God. It's no longer a God of acts. And I would say it's the hand of God that disappears, and it gets replaced by, in this case, we can call it the detoned language. So effectively, miracles and doings by God become impossible, since God has no longer access to action. He is disembodied, depersonalized. And I would say this can also lead to, and I think it led to, this is my proposal, as Wolfgang Schmidt said, a perennial religion or perennial ideology. All gods are the same because they lack hands, personality, bodies that can make them act. Wittgenstein clearly says that doesn't work for human beings nor for God. God is only powerful if he can act and do things in the world. And non-acting God doesn't have, oddly enough, any power at all. He does in that case, and I would say this is what most people say today, not my saying, he can't even know our thinking, since he doesn't know our thinking/acts. So this very harmless quote, and I would have ignored it 1 year ago. I would taken it in unconsciously, like sipping a glass of arsenic wine or something, a harmful thing. I would just read through it, I would get harm, not knowing the harm it did to me, because it's already the wound or the poisoning is already working in my body. It has already made my thinking/acting processes to shrivel. Could well pass for proposing the shopkeeper that henceforth no longer write his accounting books, but in verse. No, the sloppiness of the strings, the D-tone strings, are very similar to the Cartesians X, Y, Z. They get emasculated because they have no power for directionality. How do we know they lack dimensionality and directionality? Well, these things are added. Arrows. A true spiral is by itself a directionality. Up this goes. No supplement or additive. Compare that as a sort of emasculation, putting something in front of the male genital. Why not one of those medieval caps they used? Or the virginity lock, as the female princesses used. Speaking of Schlösser, I would say it's not Schlösser that closes off, it's Kant. I cannot accuse Kant of being frivolous, but I do say his attack, his criticism of others being frivolous is absolutely wrong. And I would say most people reading this don't know that. The point taken here by Derrida is chosen on his attention. He knows this unconsciously, Derrida. But we need to know that to understand, to get into his thinking. Act and thinking is two sides of the same thing. If they're not, they are neither thinking nor acting. Both disappears in the very same instant. we mentioned hands before, and I hope in the coming seminar, that could be recorded maybe, we can bring hands up because they have a major part in my dear colleague Calle's seminar paper. They are not unimportant because we see also that chirality, handedness, is thinking, is acting, is the hand of God. Newton, Kant has already disseminated God or made him nullified. In the strongest sense, more stronger even than ignoring him or saying that he doesn't exist. They did it more effectively by emasculating him, making him non-thinking, detoned. And maybe a comment from Kalle here. I see you preparing something interesting as usual. I put this on and check that you're in view.
Great lecture, Hans. Compliments. Let me return to Derrida's paper, page 16, about Schlosser. It's the locksmith. I love this wordplay. Schlosser was the one who translated Plato's letters into German. Schlosser is locksmith, the man who makes or keeps the keys, true or false, and so forth, so forth. It made me also think about Saint Peter, who has the keys to lock. But more importantly, I was thinking about Paul Livingstone. Here the name is appropriate. He's like a discoverer who discovers Africa or something else. I will repeat this because it's also important. Suppose, this is page 3 in Livingstone's paper. Suppose that people go on calculating the expression of P. So God, who knows everything, knows whether they will have reached 777 by the end of the world. That is apocalypse, as you point out. But can his omniscience decide whether they would have reached it after the end of the world? Excellent point. So let's say that God knows everything. He would have figured all these mathematical numbers already in advance in his head. So for us it's only to go and find them. But that, so to say, excludes an active God. In that case, God is actually not like us. God is not like a Livingstone who goes and discovers. But he is only like let's say these black people who are already in Africa waiting for Livingstone to discover them. I wouldn't say God is not like that, like these black people waiting for Livingstone. Hello Livingstone, thank you for discovering us. No, instead God is like Livingstone. Somebody who discovers. So God cannot know everything in advance. Because in that case he would not be like us. Or rather we would not be in his image. That is the point. Excellent, that is really excellent point, Hans. So applause to Hans. Great for joining Livingstone and Derrida. And also the passage about the shopkeeper. Excellent, excellent. I could repeat because it's so important. So it's page 17 in Derrida's paper. And it's actually Kant himself who says this. Derrida is quoting Kant, and we see it in the parentheses, the German words by Kant. At bottom, all philosophy is indeed prosaic, and to propose today to go back to philosophy poetically, wiederum poetisch zu philosophieren, could well pass for proposing to the shopkeeper, Kaufmann, that he henceforth no longer write his account books in prose, but in verse. So you get the point. Mathematics. We could think about Pythagoras. He compared, for him mathematics was something mystical. But imagine that everything is already out there is completely wrong. Excellent, Hans. Great, great, great.
Thank you, Kalle, and thank you for your words. Very interesting. And I sort of come to grips here with a contradiction many people notice as friends of mine, how come Newton was a deist, a faithful believer, and still had Newtonism or the classical mechanics? It's become clearer now. He's making a new God because of his discoveries or what he thought he discovered. And that God is faster than action and therefore doesn't properly act. And I do like the example of Livingston as well. I'm not sure the Africans were waiting for Livingston and maybe not even happy that he came. Maybe ruined their civilization, but yes, the example still works if you put that to the point, to the side. And it also tells a lot about Kant. He was a very, very shallow Christian in every sense, although admittedly he was a Christian. I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye for now.
Great, excellent, excellent. Everybody should hear this.